It's time for the Christmas ornament video. I'm going to make a wooden jingle bell. So there was this tree that was in front of my father-in-law's house, and in the spring of 2017, the leaves never came back out, and it had died. He had it taken out, and he asked if I wanted the trunk. Of course I said yes. So we went down one day in August of 2017 and cut up this maple trunk. And Granddad John helped me with a couple slabs, and Bonnie helped me with a couple slabs. It's turned out to be really beautiful, very light colored, very clear maple wood. So I thought it would be good for the jingle bell that I'm going to make this year. So the piece that I'm going to use was actually the top slab of the trunk. I use these pieces to weight down the stack of slabs usually, but now that everything's dry and ready to be used, I can use this piece. So I thought I would cut it into strips so I can make segments for the jingle bell. So I cut it down to a more manageable size and took the bark off. I jointed one side so I could run that against the fence on the bandsaw. I put my very advanced fence on the bandsaw, and I could cut this piece into strips. As this blade's getting a little bit dull, it wanders a little bit, so I find if I angle the fence slightly, if you're facing the blade, the far end of the fence moves towards the blade just slightly, and this will keep the workpiece against the fence. Then I could joint and plane those pieces a little bit more. I wanted them the same thickness, and I wanted one flat face to run against the fence on the table saw. Here's all the pieces that make up the section of the slab. I can cut these flat pieces into the right widths for the strips. I did a quick drawing to figure out what widths I needed and what lengths of segments I needed. I got out my segment cutting sled. So this you sort of go back and forth between the two fences to get the two angles on each segment. Once I do one ring, I like to put it together to see if my angle is right and all the seams are tight, and whether my length of segment is making the diameter of ring that I want. And it seemed to work out. I'm basically making two little bowls for each side of the sphere of the jingle bell. So the rings towards the center will be a little thinner, and the rings at the top and bottom will be wider. So I'm using a wider piece of maple for that. And it gets a little tricky at the very top and bottom, as I want all the points of the segments to come together exactly. So I have to be somewhat careful about keeping the segments perfectly shaped. I can start gluing up the rings for the sphere. I found with this one, I was putting glue on two sides of a segment, then gluing the two neighboring segments to that piece, and that would give me 4 sections of the ring. Then I could glue those 4 sections together to get the complete ring. This seemed to work pretty well. Fewer times picking up and putting down segments, I guess. And luckily I had enough of the right size hose clamps. I put a new sanding disc on the disc sander, which really sanded a lot better. I should have done this earlier. I also went from a 80 grit to a 60 grit. So it leaves a little more sanding mark, but it removes a lot more material quicker. So for doing these rings, it's really nice. I can glue the rings together. At this point, I'm going to make the two halves and leave them apart for now. And I'm trying to get them centered as best I can. I wanted to make a little block to go on each end so that I could hold the stack of rings on the lathe. So I cut a square of the same maple And I glued that onto the end using the lathe as a clamp. And hopefully that's centered, as I've found the center of the block. And it's centered based on the rim of the stack of rings. So as I turn it, being held with the block, the biggest ring should be fairly well centered, and then the smaller rings wobble a little bit, but that doesn't matter too much. The first thing I wanted to do was to clean out the inside. I carved away some of that material. I cut a piece of cardboard that was a half circle that was the size that I wanted to make the interior shape. And I could use that sort of as a rough gauge. As the inside isn't really going to be seen that much, it doesn't really have to be perfect, but it would be nice if it was close. Also, if I make the inside a sphere, then the outside will sort of match that, and hopefully it'll be close to centered. So it was pretty close. I didn't sand the inside, but I used the scraper to get it smooth. I want to make the ball that's going to go on the inside of the jingle bell. With a quick read of Wikipedia, jingle bells can have either a ball or a bar that's attached to the top. And I thought it'd be nice to just put a ball on the inside. I got a thicker piece of the same tree, and I could form a small sphere out of this. I marked a length that was equal to the diameter of the piece that I'd made. And I just started to shape a sphere from that. I've heard that smaller spheres are harder, and this definitely was a little more difficult. Once it was pretty close to a sphere, I cut it free. The leftover chunk in the chuck I figured I could use as the cup to hold the small sphere, so I carved this into a cup shape. And it needed to be a little bit smaller, so I took some of the material off. And I carved out a small cup in the end. And this will hold the small sphere, the ringer for the jingle bell. So it's just held in there with the tailstock and the cup that I just made. It was a little more difficult doing a small sphere. I think part of the problem too is my tailstock cup is too big for this. With the two sides hollowed out and the ball made, I can glue the two halves together with the ball inside. I had measured and marked where I wanted the two halves to go together, as the inside wasn't perfectly centered. I'm not sure how much this really mattered, but I did it anyways. I'll let that dry overnight. Now I'm ready to do the big turning on the sphere. So it's the same idea as the little ball in that I can get this piece as close to spherical as I can. And that mostly means turning the sides and removing material. Luckily with the segments, I have a little bit of a gauge as to how far to go, at least in the roughing section. I need to get to at least turning off the points on the exterior and the interior on all of the segments. So that gives me a guide for where the sphere is. Once I'm getting close, I can find a round object, and if you hold a round object at the right distance and get your eye and the object and the workpiece lined up, you can use the round object as a gauge to see how close you are to a circle. And if you're a little bit patient, it actually works pretty well. I'm getting pretty close at this point. I really just have to clean up the two ends. The end at the tailstock I made round and just big enough to fit in the chuck, so I flipped the piece around. As the tailstock side is a little easier to turn as the chuck isn't in the way. And I can now clean up the side that was in the chuck. And this is really just removing material as fast as I can. And we're close at this point. I can cut off the two ends on the bandsaw. I can take the chuck off and put my faceplate with a cup on it in place. I think this one will be a good size. I find it's a good idea to always clean up or sort of freshen up the cup if you haven't used it for a few months, as the wood will move a little bit. I can hold the sphere now between the drive cup and the tailstock cup. I then just turn the sphere and rotate it and turn and rotate and kind of get closer and closer to that sphere. So you use the roundness of the turning to form the sphere in 3 dimensions. And you really should only take off about half the height of the difference. If you turn all the way to a complete circle, you'll chase the sphere all the way down to nothing. This is kind of a slow, patient process. Rotate, turn, over and over and over again. But it works really well, and you get to a perfect sphere. And it was making a lot of noise because of the ball on the inside. Once I had it really close, I could start sanding. And sanding a sphere usually goes pretty fast because you're just sanding the outside, and it's a pretty simple curve to sand. I think I started with 60 grit and went up to 400 with the drill. Then I did 600, 1,000, and 1,500 with a sheet of sandpaper and my hand. While sanding, I do the same thing where I rotate and turn a little bit, then rotate it and turn a little bit. I want to cut the X pattern into the sphere that will make it a jingle bell. I thought about doing this on the table saw or even the radial arm saw, but I didn't want to hit the ball on the inside if I did it on the table saw, as the ball would be on the bottom and the blade would be on the bottom. And it's a little too big height-wise to do on the radial arm saw. I decided I could do it on the CNC machine. And I have a jig that I made for holding a sphere. I'm trying to find where the top is, as I want that in a very specific location so the X pattern fits the segmented pattern. So once I had everything set up, I could just cut 2 slots into the sphere with my longest 1/2-inch bit. And I took very light passes. This is the thing where I've worked for several days on making the sphere, and now I've got to cut it, and I can easily screw it up at this point. But it all went well. I took very light passes. This maple cuts really, really nicely. So I got 2 pretty much perfect slots. On most jingle bells I've looked at, there's a little circle at the bottom of the slot. So I could rotate the sphere and find the center of that circle and cut that circle into the sphere with a 1/4-inch bit. Then I zeroed the bit, so it's at its 0 point, and I can rotate the sphere and put the point on the sphere where I want the center of that circle and re-clamp the sphere into place. I needed to do this 4 times, and I took kind of light passes doing this, but it's not a big cutout, so it didn't take very long. I can take the sphere out now. Now it's mostly a jingle bell. It even makes noise. It has kind of a bass jingle. And it was kind of full of sawdust too. That came out pretty easily. I wanted to clean up the little bit of fuzz on the cut from the CNC machine. And I needed to get to the inside, and I've recently received what's basically an old Dremel tool. It works really well, and I got some new bits for it. It's more for carving, so I don't know if this is really its best function, but it worked okay. I could get to that inside cut and clean up that edge. I was finding it was a little bit rough, so I sanded the outside cut with a piece of sandpaper and just did that by hand. Then I put finish on. I used the cup that I used on the lathe to hold the inner ball as a little stand as I put the finish on. So it came out pretty nice. I didn't make a way to hang it. I kind of like it as more of a pure sphere, but it's hard to hold and make it jingle because there's nothing really to hold on to. But it looks cool.
Merry Christmas.
Thanks for watching, and have a safe and happy holidays.